The next section that has substantial changes is the force majeure clause. Everybody in the last 18 months has been dealing with force majeure way more than they ever wanted to because of the pandemic. And interestingly, not many people made the argument that the force majeure clause did not apply to pandemics. So they've now added pandemics, epidemics, government shutdowns, civil unrest, and governmental actions and mandates to be included in the force majeure clause. They've also added in the word right up here on the first and the second line. Before, it would only say obligation. So what is the difference between a right and an obligation in the contract? An obligation in the contract might be the buyer is obligated to make their escrow deposit within 3 days of the effective date. So if a force majeure event is preventing the buyer from making their deposit, the previous contract protected the buyer and extended the date that they had to make escrow. Now that rights are included in the contract, there are other things that can be extended. So for instance, it is the right of the buyer to have a walkthrough prior to closing. It is the right of the buyer to get an appraisal done, to inspect the property during the inspection period. So rights can now be extended due to force majeure. And it's going to be interesting to see how this works. For instance, what if an inspector is on his way to go inspect a property and the inspection period is going to end on Friday? He's on his way there Thursday and a bridge is blocked by protesters. And let's say they do this for 2 days and the inspection period ends on Friday and the inspector can't get there because he literally cannot drive there. I think that this contract is now saying that the inspection period can be extended due to force majeure. What if the seller comes down with COVID and the appraiser doesn't want to go appraise the property, or the inspector doesn't want to go there because the seller has COVID? Does that extend the inspection period? If I'm on the buyer side, I'm going to argue yes, it does. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this stuff plays out over the next year as we're still in pandemic mode. We never know if we get new strains, or let's say there are more protests or something like that. They're now included in this force majeure section. And just to clarify how the force majeure section actually works, a lot of people believed that the force majeure section means that either party can cancel the contract. That's not how it works in practice. The timeline will be extended for a reasonable time, up to 7 days after the force majeure event no longer prevents performance under the contract. So if the buyer can't make their escrow deposit on the 3rd day, we have to wait until the force majeure event stops preventing them from making the deposit, and then they get a reasonable time up to 7 days after the force majeure event. So reasonably, they might be able to make the deposit a day or two after the force majeure event ends, but it can't be more than 7 days. And then later on, it says that you cannot extend performance under this contract more than 30 days beyond the closing date. So if a force majeure event is preventing closing and it continues to prevent closing, once we get to that 30-day marker, then either party can terminate the contract. So in these days with electronic closings, it's very, very rare for a force majeure event to prevent some sort of obligation. And my office did not have any force majeure events outside of 2 that prevented a closing during COVID. And that was when we had 2 Canadian sellers that could not leave their property and could not have anyone go to their property to notarize documents for them. So they couldn't get a FedEx and they couldn't have a witness. Remote online notary has changed to allow for remote online witnesses now. So if that same scenario happened this year, the sellers would still be able to sign their deed and get it notarized because we could do it electronically. Last year, at the time that happened, probably in April or so, we couldn't get it done. So we had to extend the closing date until someone was able to actually notarize documents in Canada. But outside of that, we really didn't have anything that was preventing closing. Now, with this addition of rights and not just obligations, I'm not sure what's going to happen. I gave a couple of examples of what could potentially happen with inspectors and appraisers and sellers getting COVID and things like that. I will say that if everybody agrees that there's some sort of force majeure event, it's a good idea to put in writing what everybody agrees to. So that way we don't have to go back to the force majeure section and start trying to argue over what is a force majeure, what is not. I think over the last 18 months, everybody has kind of gotten a little bit more accepting of things being delayed due to strange occurrences, whether it's pandemic related or governmental action related.